Can you see that I'm sharing my screen?
Yes, we can see you. Okay, so welcome to everyone joining the webinar. I'd like to thank you for attending. We're very excited. My name is Zoe. I'm a senior at NMU and a student employee at the Beaumere UP Heritage Center. So I'll be moderating. And before we start the presentation, I'll just go over a couple of logistical things. So we're in a Zoom webinar. We can't see or hear any of you in attendance, but you can submit questions through that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit those throughout the presentation. We'll have time at the end and I'll pick some to ask our presenter. Now I would like to introduce our first presenter, Emily Lonto. Emily lives and works in Marquette, Michigan, where she's the director and curator of Northern Michigan University's DeVos Art Museum. Additionally, Lonto has taught foundations since 2010 as a contingent assistant professor at NMU School of Art and Design. Her research focuses on ideas surrounding the everyday, place, and memory. As a member of the Marquette Public Art Commission, Lonto collaborates on creating policies and projects that support the expansion and longevity of public art. On campus, Lonto serves as a planning committee member of the Uniting Neighbors in the Experience of Diversity Conference and serves on the Diversity Common Reader Project Committee. Lonto earned a BFA in drawing and painting from Northern Michigan University and an MFA in interdisciplinary studio arts from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Thank you so much, Emily, for
Thank you. I am so happy to be here today. First, I'd like to give thanks and acknowledge that Northern Michigan University is located on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy. Gichinam Vini Zimving is the traditional name of Marquette. So I'm here today to talk about life in the Upper Peninsula as reflected through the artwork of Cecelia Kettunen and Niel Haapala. But before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of insider-outsider. I think it's important to ask questions about the framework of this phrase and that the language that we use to describe our experience is also important. Insider creates a binary or a marked experience indicating something is valued and then something is lesser so. So being inside implies that you're just that, working inside a system of education or a system of having, where outsider implies that you're working outside of that system or not having. And this binary sets up a language of unequal power, and it also influences society's values, which also then influences meaning. And so working in an educational institution, I understand that inside language is meant to benefit people like me, and it's meant to create a power structure that devalues others. And I really want to say that whether you go to school or you go to the school of life, your curiosity provides a framework for education for you each and every day. If you're inquisitive in nature, your thirst for knowledge and your unique experience will provide you with plenty to share and teach. And there are many ways to learn about the world. And no matter what path you find yourself on, if you continue to nurture your curiosity and share your experience with others, you'll no doubt keep learning. And this is precisely what both of these artists did. I also think insider-outsider might describe the way that artists often work in the Upper Peninsula. The outside art world is much different than the art scene here. The art world depends on collectors, museums, collections, academies, connoisseurs, publications, critics, experts, galleries, museums, art fairs, appraisals, and auction prices. In the Upper Peninsula, we have a large number of creative people who do not operate within the art world at large. While we have many art appreciators, we don't have people who write art criticism. We have some collectors that operate in a slightly different system, and we don't have the same support of the art market that exists in large centers. And so while the internet has allowed for more connectivity, it hasn't changed many of these other circumstances. The other thing that I'd like to say is this also makes it really important that we have places like the museum that are able to capture the artwork and the experience of different generations in a small regional and remote area. So the two artists that I'll be talking about today are Niel Haapala, who lived from 1909 to 2002, and Cecelia Kettunen, who lived from 1896 to 1992. The two artists are both represented in the local regional collection at the DeVos Art Museum, and the work is part of a large collection of a few thousand objects that include Native American art, local regional art, illustration, Japanese artwork, modern contemporary design, and print and photography. We're really lucky to have original artworks of both of these artists in our collection. So Cecelia Kettunen is who I'll start with today, and I have a lot of the information that I have is thanks to Melissa Matusak, Wayne Francis, John Hubbard, and the Ishpeming Library. There was correspondence between Cecelia Kettunen and former museum director Wayne Francis. In this correspondence, Cecelia alluded to her manuscripts being sent to the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian. Melissa Matusak, who is also a former museum director, uncovered the manuscript at the Ishpeming Library. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about today comes from that. This photo here is from an exhibition of Cecelia's work that took place at the museum in 2008. It's an exhibition that I was able to work on as a student when I was getting my BFA at NMU. So N, which stands for Nana, Cecelia Kettunen was born in Ishpeming on September 15th, 1896. She's the third of 7 children. Her father was a tailor. Her parents were Finnish, so she was born to immigrant parents who spent their time working in the Houghton area before settling in Ishpeming. Kettunen attended the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she received her BA in art education in 1917, and then she went back there later in life to get an MFA in 1945. Throughout her career, she alternated between student and teacher, pursuing an education at Yale University, the Art Student League of Chicago, and she studied briefly at NMU. She took teaching positions all over, and so she lived in places like Bluffton, Ohio, Peru, Nebraska, and Virginia, Minnesota before she returned to the Upper Peninsula. At the end of her career, she ended in Houghton, Michigan, where she was the art supervisor for the Houghton school system until she retired in 1960. Throughout all of this time, she often returned to the family cottage on Lake George in Three Lakes, Michigan, and she actively exhibited her work throughout her life. She had paintings and exhibitions at the Detroit Institute of the Arts and the Art Institute of Chicago. She was also a Ford Foundation sponsored artist in a traveling exhibition of UP artists. So the systems that she's working in provided her with a lot of connections to the outside art world. This is a picture of downtown Ishpeming, and it's courtesy of Jack Deo and Superior View. In her manuscript, Cecelia says, "My birthday falls on September 15th, and I was born in 1896 at Mud Lake on Park Street, Ishpeming, in a little home owned by my parents. I was the second of their children born here at that time, and one of Mama's sisters had come from Finland. Her name was Elsa Krita. She was selected to be one of my godmothers. And I had Mr. and Mrs. Pete Kosky, also for godparents. Of her babies, Mama exclaimed, Babe and I were the biggest crybabies. In 1898, we moved over to the corner of Division and First Streets to live in a large apartment, second floor business of building Mama and Papa had purchased. Among childhood memories, which stands out quite clearly, as I recall it, was one morning, and I was the oldest of the children at home with Auntie. She had joined our family in early 1900s, and Mama must have been out shopping alone or helping at the church with the lady sewing circle. Auntie needed baking soda, so she sent me to the grocery store, which was about a block from our door, but not the same block as our house, so it meant I had to cross the street. She had me repeat to her several times the name of the article, Arm & Hammer Baking Soda, Arm & Hammer Baking Soda. When I arrived at the corner of my block before crossing the street, the fire engine, which was fiery red in color and drawn by handsome black horses, dashed by. Of course, I had not only to stop to admire all of that, but also for safety's sake, I realized I had to stop. When all of this excitement was over, Arm & Hammer Baking Soda had fled my mind, but I proceeded to the store and went in. I stepped up to the counter and surveyed the shelves of groceries. Hilla Candelou, later Mrs. Herman Coinsto, clerked at her brother's store. She waited on me and I chose a large can of tomatoes. It had a gorgeous label of fiery red tomatoes on it. With that in my arms, I returned home. Auntie kept the can of tomatoes and sent me off again, repeating, Arm & Hammer baking soda. The second trip, I decided on a large size oatmeal package and went home with it in my arms. By this time, I guess my auntie had decided she was going to train my memory, if nothing else, and she sent me off again, repeating, Arm & Hammer baking soda. This trip turned out differently than the others. He, I guess, could see that I was nonplussed and decided to go home with me to find out what it was that Auntie wanted. Auntie rewarded her with 10 o'clock coffee and cakes and returned with Hilla to the store to pick up Arm & Hammer baking soda. So you can see her manuscripts are quite vivid in detail, and even at a young age, she's really attracted to color and finding beauty in her everyday surroundings. When she was a child, to quote Cecelia, her parents sought to get us out into the country for the summer months. So the Kettunens spent their summers homesteading in the Keweenaw Peninsula in the early 1900s between Barriga and Mass City. You can see here, there are some details about how long it is between these different areas that they're living in. But then they find a suitable summer residence for the family in Three Lakes in 1912. And so this is the camp that she returns to throughout her life. The camp is on Lake George. And while she mostly spent time there in the summer and in sort of search of solace and inspiration for painting, she also spent other times there throughout her career. Some report cards from her time in Ishpeming in both middle school and high school. And you can see in some cases, she's doing better in other subjects than she is as drawing, but drawing is something she pursues throughout her life. I mentioned that she went to Chicago, and this was really made an impression on her. She spent 1914 to 1917 at the School of the Art Institute. And throughout those years, there were 6 people in her class that she was close to. She said that they were all serious about her work, about their work, but they did find time to go out and occasionally have lunch or get together. After graduation, they seemed to part their separate ways. This is the building that she lived in Chicago. And she speaks about how profound an experience that was. She said, while in Chicago, I experienced a contrast that has remained vivid in my mind. This was in 1914 when I was living at the YWCA at 830 South Michigan Avenue, which housed hundreds of young women who were either studying or working in Chicago. Coming from a house where harmonious surroundings were paramount, I naturally felt at times the corridors of the Y were quite barren. Steps and hallways were uncarpeted, and there was a metallic reality about the elevator that hauled us up and down. After one trip to the lounge, which was in the first floor in the front of the building, to your left as you entered the building, I never went there again, as I sensed it was a place dedicated to the young ladies who had boyfriends who were calling on them, and I did not wish to intrude on their privacy. In the room that I occupied with Mildred Keene of Wheatland, Wyoming, who also attended the Art Institute, were 2 straight back chairs, a small square table, a double bed, a bureau, and a closet. Very, very barren, I found it. In fact, at first it frightened me to tears. The president of the Y was Mrs. D, a very gracious lady. One day I was told I was invited with 14 other girls to her apartment in Chicago to spend a Sunday evening. I shall never forget how shocked and surprised I was to see that Chicago possessed an apartment building that spoke of such lush elegance as carpeted stairs, soft lighting, and the greatest surprise came when we entered Mrs. D's apartment with candlelight there. Wonderful, wonderful to see that there were candles and candlelight in Chicago. So she really missed some of these simple, quiet pleasures that she had experienced at home. While she was in Chicago, she also worked at the Hull House, and the Hull House was started by Jane Addams. It was a community house that provided classes for both adults and children, had a theater, a coffee house, an art gallery, a gymnasium, a book bindery. And it's notable that Jane Addams was the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So during the years of 16 and 17, she taught at the Hull House and also at the Chicago Commons. At that point, she says, this is where Dr. Taylor was in charge. I had classes in craft work, mostly with children who most likely worked during the day and attended school at night. At the Commons, the night school teachers were invited to have dinner there. At the table on which we were served was highly polished wood, dark in tone. Our plates were silver. Were on lacy mats, so there was a certain air of elegance. Dr. Taylor, Mrs. Taylor, and their daughter dined with us. They were all of good build, so that added to the stateliness of the occasion. We enjoyed being in that atmosphere, which was much more imposing than the atmosphere of the public cafeteria, where as a rule we had our dinner during the weekdays. The classes were composed of boys ranging from 10 to 14. The neighborhood must have been one of the toughest because one evening when we arrived to attend our class, we were told that the police had to be called to the scene the day before. The head of the department warned us about thievery, which was prevalent among the boys. In an immense cage-like affair, all of his instruments, supplies, etc., were kept behind lock and key. We were given a certain equipment for our classes, and we were warned to keep careful tally of some. How well I remember how anxious the boys were to go on with their work. They would, in their hurry, really snatch their projects, as their names were called, and crawl under the table to work uninterrupted on their reed baskets. So this was quite impressionable. So throughout her life, Cecelia moves around to teach. I mentioned she stayed in Bluffton, Ohio, in Virginia, Minnesota. She was in Nebraska. She was in Houghton. Throughout all of this time, she was an avid documentarian of her life and her work. She took many photos chronicling her life and her friends, her travels, her adventures. You can see here, this is Bluffton, where she spent her later life, but also time earlier on. This is a picture of the post office there. There's an incredible amount of detail, as you can see in her writing. She talks about, you turn to the left when you walk in the door. This detail also carries over into her manuscripts, her photographs, and her notes. She was sort of a voracious note taker, and in her notes from classes, art classes that she took, in addition to writing notes, she often will draw something that that depicts the thing that the writing is talking about as a visual aid. So she'll draw in artwork in the margins quite frequently. She also corresponded with numerous people throughout her lifetime. So when she was in towns, she would keep in touch with students or people who had left an impression on her. Just last month, I received a phone call from somebody in California who had said that her mother was one of Cecelia's students and that they corresponded for a number of decades. This woman said she would like to share the letters from her mother and Cecelia with us, which we're really lucky to have a lot of that correspondence here at the museum because of John Hubbard, which I'll tell you more about later. But so this is a photo that this woman sent to me. You can see Cecelia Kettunen is in the photo right here. And the quote underneath her name says, "Look what the cat dragged in." And so correspondence was really an important way for her to keep in touch with people that she met in different places throughout the world. At some point, Cecelia acquired the family camp at Three Lakes, and she would continue to return there when the weather allowed. It was not heated and it didn't have plumbing, but she did spend a few winters there as well, and it really seems to influence her life throughout her career. Here are a few more photos from Three Lakes and Cecelia at Three Lakes. The camp is really the reason why the DeVos has this artwork in the collection. Since she spent so much time at Three Lakes, much of her belongings were still at the camp when she entered a nursing home a few years before her death. This is when Kettunen made a donation of 200 paintings, sketches, drawings, that had remained at the camp to the museum. It is easily the largest collection of a single artist that we have in the museum's permanent collection. And then, as luck would have it, John Hubbard, who is the painting professor here for many, many years, was the faculty who went in to retrieve the work from Three Lakes. When the camp went up for sale, Professor Hubbard purchased it and helped save a lot of her personal possessions, including ephemera like correspondence and photographs that had been left behind. These items, sadly, were not wanted by the family. And Cecelia never married and she never had kids. And most of her closest family lived on the West Coast. So we're really lucky to have a lot of these details. And someday we hope to do something more with it. Mural designs were really important to Cecelia throughout her life. The museum has several drawings and designs of these from the collection. So she's looking at these institutional places and making maquettes or fictional interiors for homes and public spaces, often places like libraries. And then she would enter them into national competitions. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Cecelia is her ability to capture people's likeness in portraits. She was a lovely portrait painter, really adept at it. And these are paintings that we have in the collection. They were actually done in the 1940s while she was at doing her graduate work at the Art Institute. It was at this time also that she was selected as a group of students to work with the New York artist Peppino Mangrovite, who was an artist of Italian descent, who often made work based on his own observation, but he had this big mural project. He also had connections to New York. He took classes at Cooper Union and the Art Students League and was really influenced by Robert Henry, which I think later on I'll show you some connections between Henry's work and Cecilia's. Henry often asked his students to think about their work and choose themes that were heartfelt or based upon their personal experiences. So it was during the same time when she's working at the Art Institute, getting her master's, that she stayed at Three Lakes, and she had a major inspiration, not just for a mural, but for an entire architectural structure called the Church of the Universal Religion, or the Shrine for the Universal Religion. It was in November 19th, 1942, and this is from her manuscript. She says, "I was entrusted with great trust, the design for the Universal Shrine. I had spent the fall at Three Lakes in my studio home. All of the days, of course, during the fall at Three Lakes, I painted in my studio. November 19th was a Thursday. That evening after retiring, it seemed I was in a semi-conscious state when I received the idea for the shrine. I was sleeping in my larger bedroom where Mama and Papa's white walnut bed and bureau. On the bed, Mama had given birth to her 3 last children. It's a bed very closely associated with our childhood. When I got up on Friday morning, I did not get to work on the drawings for the shrine. Instead, I started them on Saturday. I am superstitious in regard to starting anything on Friday. I don't know where I acquired that superstition, but once I started working on the drawings, I worked unceasingly. As I worked, it seemed I was given clearer and clearer direction as to how the design should be. I worked up to 10 different views of the shrine in charcoal on the regular size charcoal paper. The first is the facade of an entry to the shrine with a glimpse of the shrine proper way at the end of the long passageway. The idea of this long passageway is symbolical, a distance an individual must traverse to attain this vision of God, the eternal light at which the shrine expresses. So this is kind of a radical turn in Cecelia's work. And these are a few of the drawings that we have in the collection. She's really thinking about this as a place of all-encompassing where everybody would be welcome and all religions could seek solace. In the Church of the Universal Shrine, or in the shrine, she also includes a mural. And this is a sketch from that mural. Each panel is different. We have all the pieces. She actually cut out all the tiny pieces for each of these parts. They're all different pieces that would go together, and they have notes on them about which section each religion correlates to. And she said, before I completed to my satisfaction the charcoal drawings, cold weather persisted, so I decided to go for the holidays in Ishpeming and join the Dobbs family. There I wrote Mrs. Roosevelt about my plans for the shrine, asking permission to take them to the White House for her to see. So she's always promoting her work, always advancing and trying to advance her work and trying to expand her audience. So that year she arrives in DC in February. She works on the drawing some more, and she sends another letter to Roosevelt's secretary in April, where she gets an appointment to show Roosevelt the drawings. Even though she never found widespread recognition, she was a talented painter and a strong female, incredibly gifted and inspired. Her depictions of the landscape and industry provide us with insight to the region. And while she's working in rural areas, she's really in conversation with a lot of other artists. Here you can see Cecelia on the left and Charles Sheeler on the right. Cecelia on the left again, and Lauren Harris, a Canadian painter, well-known Canadian painter in the group of 7 on the right. Here you can see Charles Birchfield on the left and Cecelia on the right. And these are all painters who are really well known within modernism. So she's really looking out. Here, Cecelia on the left and Henri Matisse on the right. You can see this is sort of in the afterglow of Art Nouveau. There's still an interest in decoration. There's a real attention to the background here in both of these pieces. In this, I believe Kettunen's piece is from a trip she took west, looking at the landscape, and then Emily Carr on the left is a well-known Canadian painter of the time. Here you can see Cecelia side by side with A.Y. Jackson, who is also a well-known member of the group of 7. And you can see there are similarities in the way that these artists are depicting the landscape. And finally, one, or maybe there's a couple more here. This is Hilma of Klimt, which I think there's such a striking resemblance between these works. Hilma of Klimt's work is much earlier, but she also is creating this altarpiece, looking at these sort of sacred spaces and depicting them in a really precise geometric way. Here's another Tom Thompson depicting the Northern Lights and Cecelia Kettunen's depiction on the right. And then finally, Robert Henry and Cecelia Kettunen with this really sensitive attention to detail in these portraits. So Cecelia is really working within the institution, but also depicting life around her, taking note of all of her influences and gathering and collecting a lot of information from the everyday. Niel Haapala moved here in 1914. He moved to Loudsburg in Elder County with his family. He immigrated from Finland, and he followed his father's footsteps and began logging in 1925 at age 15. That logging was a way of life around here. In the top of this image, you can see Camp Entrain, and at the bottom, you can see the Nama and the Nama sawmill. So throughout the 30s and 40s, Haapala worked at logging camps across the central Upper Peninsula in Nama and Ralph and Sturgeon River and Whitefish River and Stoner Lake and Camp Autrain. And it's at Camp Autrain where he has this chance meeting. So Camp Autrain was a civilian conservation corps camp that turned into a prisoner of war camp, and it's here where he meets POW Otto First, who introduces Haapala to art. And this introduction really plants a seed that doesn't take shape fully until much later in Haapala's life. So at some point during Haapala's career, while he's still working, he takes this correspondence course, and here's where you can really see that he is taking in his everyday life and translating it into something new. So the way that Kettunen's work is looking out, Haapala's work is looking in and then looking in some more. He's mining his everyday life and translating it into these cartoons. And the cartoons really started after he took a correspondence course. But later on in life, he's mining his everyday life and translating it into paintings that depicts logging and stump farming, or the people around him, and also objects of decorative beauty. So lumber and logging has a pretty big role in the Upper Peninsula, although it's often overshadowed by the vast stretches of copper and iron ore mines in the Upper Peninsula. these mines would not have been able to expand or develop without timber. Lumber was needed for so many aspects of mining, from wooden railroad ties to making charcoal for fuel. The logging industry is a major part of the Upper Peninsula culture, and Niel Haapala has a really particular way of talking about this culture. In his formative years, he spent a lot of time in temporary logging camps. These camps would often contain a few hundred people living in very modest dwellings, with certain buildings being designated as schools or shops, blacksmiths, dance halls. These temporary communities, each one as unique as its residents, left a big imprint on Haapala. And during this time, you have to think the logging was really done until the logging was complete, until there were no trees left, and then the camps moved on. So many of the camps that exist today, lots of them have been almost completely returned to nature. This is an example of a painting that Niel did later in life. And I'll talk a little bit about how his career expanded, but it really sheds light on a particular time in the UP. And if we think about it, less than 100 years ago, the land was logged completely without the help of machines. So we didn't have cranes or trucks or chainsaws. It's kind of hard for us to imagine how these giant trees could be chopped down and moved from within the forest using only manpower and animal power. So Niel doesn't start painting or carving until he retires. His creative career really begins then. He used the experience from his life in logging and worked from memory to represent the past. Making sculptures carved from wood was really seemed natural for him because he understood the material so well. So he set up a studio in his basement of his Trinary home where he would paint and carve. He treated every day like a work day, even into retirement. He'd wake up early and have breakfast and then start working for the day. But instead of logging, he was painting or carving or sculpting. In almost every carving that he made, he used trees that were harvested from his property. He also made his own tools. As you can see here, this is a sander. He also made his own bandsaw and some really unique tools. In an interview with his son is like, the neighbors asked, "Are you afraid of somebody stealing your tractor on your property?" And he says, "No, because my dad made it and they'd never be able to figure out how to start it, because oftentimes if something broke, he would just replace it with something that would work, but that wouldn't be the same as something on a manufactured tractor or tool." So this is Loudspur again, that place where Niel and his family first moved to. Spurs are short rail lines, usually built to move or cut timber to the market. This one served the Brewster Lumber Company. And while Niel was really young, they lived in Loudspur. His mother did the washing for neighborhood families, and his father worked in the woods cutting timber for charcoal. So you can see the memory that he has of his mother's role there as well being depicted in this. So his paintings aren't really that far off from, they seem sort of unimaginable, but as we see, this is a photograph from the 1890s from Shorpy, which is a really great archive of historical photos. This is logging in the 1890s. And here is Haapala's waiting for help from the starting team, quite similar to the photograph that we see here. This is logging at Nama in the 1930s. Nama was a logging camp owned by the Bay de Nakat Logger Company. And Nama, which is Anishinaabe for sturgeon, was located on the Sturgeon River, and the camp employed 35 men who worked year-round producing pulpwood, ties, and logs. The large contraption that you see in this picture was for moving wood piles. It's called a boom. It was mounted on a wooden sled that could easily be moved. Here, painting really allowed him to set entire scenes and give us a glimpse into that era of his memory. This is from the collection of the Alger County Historical Society, and you can see a changing of era This painting is called hot logging. So hot logging is different than cold logging. Hot logging is logging in which the logs are taken from stumps directly to the stream or the mill instead of being put into piles. You can see in the painting he really creates an atmospheric effect. He is using contrasting colors to set the scene. So while he wasn't taught art in school, he paid a lot of attention to the world around him and the details in it. This is also from the collection of the Alger County Historical Society. Charcoal iron is a substance created by smelting of iron ore with charcoal. And all iron making blast furnaces were fueled by charcoal until coke was introduced in early 1700s. But in the United States, where timber for charcoal was abundant, charcoal furnaces lingered much longer. And so you can see him depicting that here. This is in Munising, and he's saying it's around 1867. And here again, some of those honeycomb furnaces. This is a boarding house for single men that he depicts. You can see he has a lot of, there's a lot of focus on the people in this. They're the highest brightness, they're close to us. He also is really interested in pattern in a lot of his work. And here, this is a piece that we have in the DeVos Art Museum collection, and it depicts some of the conditions of logging in the winter. And so when the heavy sled was fully loaded, it headed down the road to the bank, the logs along the frozen river until the spring thaw. So each night a crew drove a wagon up and down with dripping water down the road to keep it iced. At this time, debris of any kind, like horse manure, was removed from the ice road. And then on steep inclines, sluicing teams tied ropes to trees to ease the load gently and prevent the sled from running over the horses. So these were really dangerous times. And here, even though it's depicted as sort of idyllic, there were a lot of hazards in logging. This is Otto First. This is the person who really inspired Niel. He was a German prisoner of war in the 40s who planted the seed or impulse in Haapala that wouldn't really fully mature until he started carving in his retirement. But this is a portrait that Niel drew of him, and then Otto First's work on the right. So I think Haapala offers us this unique view of the Upper Peninsula, but he also has this incredible technical skill in rendering figures from wood. While many of these carvings also have a little humor in them, and some of his paintings or portraits, which I didn't show you many of, become caricatures, you can see he really is paying attention to the people and the situations around him. And drawing his personal memories, translating them for us. It's through these small histories like Haapala's and Kettunen's that we're able to really learn about who we are. I'm able to talk about these two artists because of a lot of the research that was done by people before me, including Diane Kordich, Melissa Matusek, John Hubbard, Kenny Haapala, the Alger County Historical Museum, and thanks to them for holding on to so many important materials and expansive research. I've also been really lucky to work with some incredible volunteers on this project. Sally Klosser began the project, Sandy Quinnell, Marie Chilman, Pavi. Many people were able to work on this project throughout the years, also Nancy. And so without all of this help, we wouldn't have even the tiny story that I was able to have time to share with you today. So thanks so much.
Thank you. We now have time for some questions if anyone would like to put them into the Q&A, and I'll ask them. So one question that we got, is the museum open with pandemic restrictions?
The museum is open with pandemic restrictions only to the NMU community. So NMU students, faculty, and staff are welcome to come in as long as we're wearing masks and social distancing. And we also have people checking in so that we're able to contact trace.
Awesome. And are the majority of Haapala's works in private collection or in Alger County?
It's kind of split up. So Kenny, his son, has a lot of works. There's a lot in Alger County, and then there's some at the Friedan collection, which is at Marquette High School. The Alger County Historical Museum has boxes of the cartoons and has several paintings. And then there are a few collectors in Marquette who have like maybe 8 or 10 paintings in their collection, or several sculptures in their collection. So it's kind of spread out. We only have 1 painting and 1 carving in our collection, and that the painting that we have was the Getting Ready to Ice the Road, which was a gift from Diane Kordich and Rusman Yagi.
Awesome. We have another. Do you have a favorite piece of artwork in these collections?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard. Like, I think there's so many really sweet artworks. It would be hard for me to pick one. And there are so many different areas I could talk about how they sourced their inspiration. I really love some of the logging depictions of logging because it seems so surreal or just unbelievable in some ways, like something unimaginable, and yet it was like 100 years ago, so that's even more unbelievable, that it was like such a short time ago. I think I really love some of Cecelia's portraits and some of her studies that were really quick. So like the color in this is just amazing. Like you sense that this is sort of like a incredible experience. Like it's sort of you're awestruck by the beauty of some of the spaces. I also kind of like the work that she makes that's really quickly done sketches of I know I have one here of and I can't find it, of snow, where she is just picturing the edge of snow in watercolor. So she's doing something really quick, and it isn't really intended to be the work, but it becomes the work because it's just so immediate. So I love those things too.
If anyone else would like to submit a question, we still have time.
I think too, some of the work that I didn't show you of Cecelia's that's really great are these drawings she did in figure studies. They show a very certain hand, and her sisters, 2 of her other sisters, also studied art. And so I think like that was probably pretty wild at this time to be able to go to school to study art as a young woman. I think being the first woman at the Yale Architecture School and then also teaching in Houghton, Michigan is kind of this like your world is really big.
All right, well, I think we don't have any other questions. So thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your presentation. Yeah, and our next will start at 9:30.
Thank you.